Good morning. Thanks, Dirk and Cordula, for the introductions so far, and thanks for inviting us to present our work in the area of employment. I mean, it's always our work and the joint efforts of the NSIs in the member states, of course. I've prepared some slides. We tested half an hour ago and it worked, so I hope it's still working now.
We can see them, Christoph.
Okay, yeah. So I will brief you, guide you through how we are trying to tackle the measurement of employment. I will talk a little bit about the sources and methods, and then I will try to show some results and also try to link it to the pandemic. And then, of course, I hope to have some takeaways for you to think about afterwards. So basically what we have to do is looking for jobs, luckily not our own jobs, but other people's jobs. There's an extremely high policy relevance for data on tourism employment. When we talk about the economic part of tourism, it's always about the share in GDP and about the job creation machine that tourism can be. And it's not surprising, but it's always in groups that are often less advantaged on the labor market that there's a potential to find a job in tourism. So that's why, of course, it's important to monitor this. Unfortunately, it's hard to find official data, and this is a general thing when we want to discuss the economic dimension of tourism. There's no industry classification like ISIC or NAIS that clearly distinguishes tourism branches. It's always a mixture of bits and pieces that we can find. So tourism-related jobs can be in many different tentacles of the economy. We can identify those tentacles, but then it's difficult to identify the tourism share within those sectors. For instance, in the retail, part of the turnover, part of the value added, and also part of the employment will be linked to the presence of tourists in a specific area. But of course, it's also linked to the consumption by locals who live there. Also, another shortcoming is that, and it was mentioned, there's the system of tourism satellite accounts, which includes a table on employment. And also this is a table that is in general poorly covered by most countries. Of course, bringing it back to the lack of primary data. So having this in mind, I mean, the strong policy needs and the lack of obvious data, we've tried to find creative solutions. And as you see, they're actually quite simple. It's basically reusing existing sources that most countries might have anyway. So we use basically the labor force survey, and which I think is a household survey conducted in all countries around the world, and structural business statistics. This is what the thing is called in the EU setting, but it's basically a large enterprise survey digging a bit deeper into the annual balance sheets data. And I think also most statistical offices will have this kind of business survey. And I will not discuss this in this presentation, but we also try to use some data from earnings and labor costs, again, for the same branches of the economy. The advantages is, at least for us, these data sources are harmonized at European level. So even if there are shortcomings, to which I will come back later, the data is harmonized and we can compare between the 27 countries. Also, as I said, I think most of these sources are available in one form or another in most countries. So we think that we call it simple methodology, should also be replicable in most countries. What do we publish? On the one hand, we publish absolute figures. Those come from this enterprise survey. On the other hand, we try to dig into the characteristics, and this comes from the labor force survey. As I will show in a minute, the scope is not the same. So it's not necessarily possible to combine the two, but it does give a complete picture. So what do we cover? And I will not go in detail. You might be familiar with the list of tourism industries that is in the IRTS, the international recommendations, as well as tourism satellite accounts. So we identified for the European setting which are the relevant ones for our tourism sector. For instance, we assume that for tourism in Europe, the real estate sector is so dominantly about residential housing, not so much about second homes or tourists, that we excluded it. But it largely coincides with the IRTS list of tourism industries. So we take all those detailed branches from structural business statistics, which allows us to say something about the tourism industries. For the labor force surveys, on the right-hand side, it's a bit more limited because there the industry classification is not an important variable, so we only have it at two-digit level. So there we just take three sectors: airline transport, accommodation, and tour operators, travel agencies, where we expect that there's a clear connection with tourism. Again, it's only a subset of the tourism industry, but it does give a glimpse of the type of jobs. And I will come to that now. So some figures, first on the absolute figures, this is pre-pandemic, there were about 30 million people in Europe employed in one of these tourism industries. Again, these 13 million people might also include people who actually never see a tourist because they work in a shop in an area of a country where there's never any tourism at all. So that's one of the, let's say, the over coverage issues. On the other hand, there's a few industries that we don't include. And I honestly mentioned retail as an example in the previous bullet point, but actually retail is not included. And as I said, there might be quite some people working in retail that would not be there if there was no presence of tourists. The same for culture, for sports. I mean, we could say that maybe to compensate, but we don't really know. Anyway, one solution would be to apply tourism ratios as is done in the system of tourism satellite accounts. In practice, it doesn't seem to work for employment because the ratios are actually the demand-driven consumption that is applied to the monetary values. We discussed this with the TSA experts some months ago, and they also concluded that the same ratios cannot be applied to the employment. So we are also not doing this currently. So these tourism industries, these 13 million people account for 20%, 21% of employment in the services. And of course, in the more touristic countries like Greece and Cyprus, it's almost up to half. We have an article if you want more background information, and I think the article and a recent news article was also mentioned in Cordura's overview earlier on. Now, to look a bit deeper into the characteristics, as I said, the tourism labor market tends to give opportunities to people who might otherwise have difficulties to find a job. We see, I mean, the upper part shows the situation of the people employed in tourism, or the characteristics of those employed in tourism. The lower part gives the total economy. So we see there's relatively more female workers in tourism, relatively more part-time workers, relatively more lower educated, foreign citizens, young people. Also in terms of the type of employment, in general, there's much more people with seniority less than 2 years, and there's also more, so of course linked to it, there's also more temporary contracts. So it is a very specific sector, but it might fill specific needs of workers as well. So we can of course not ignore the pandemic. What we see in the data is that tourism employment was relatively resilient. When you see this graph, you would say that I'm wrong, because I mean the two lines with the sharp drop from 2019 to 2020, it's actually these the combined three tourism industries: air transport, accommodation, and tour operators, travel agencies. And the green was in accommodation, so we see a drop with about 16% in 2020, so the first year of the pandemic, while the other sectors of the economy, services as a whole, the economy as a whole, didn't see such a sharp drop. Still, the employment was relatively resilient, because when we look at the employment, for instance, for accommodation, it dropped with 16-17%. However, the volume indicators and night spend dropped with 51%. So, and of course, the volumes usually drop faster, and the employment follows. Of course, there's also a big chunk of, let's say, fixed costs in employment, no matter of how many people stay at a hotel, for instance. Also linked to the characteristics of the jobs, we saw that in 2020 compared to 2019, there were relatively fewer foreign workers and relatively fewer young workers. And against the background of this high turnover of staff, I showed this lower seniority. Of course, with the pandemic, when borders are closed, it's less likely that foreign workers enter the labor market in a new country. So this explains this drop. For the young workers, it's probably the same. I showed in the previous slide that the while the volumes dropped significantly, the employment was a bit more resilient. Of course, this means that staff that was already present in tourism companies had quite a good chance to survive and to stay. Of course, companies were definitely not attracting new people, which in general means young people who just left school. So this probably explains why in 2020 the share of young workers dropped. This was just to illustrate how the labor force survey data adds like perspective to the analysis of the tourism labor markets. Now to conclude and also a bit to repeat, this is not rocket science. It just gives some employment insights, but we think they are quite, let's say, scientifically robust in spite of their shortcomings. A big strength is there's no additional collection costs. The data is collected by our colleagues in other departments and we reuse it. There's no additional respondent burden in current times of budget cuts and care for respondent burden. This is important. So we use existing sources, which also means, as I said, most countries have these sources. So basically everybody can do something along the same lines. And as I tried to show with the examples, we get some insights in the volumes, so in the number of persons employed in the sector, but also some insight in the characteristics or the quality of the jobs. There are some shortcomings, so there's no need to hide it. As usual with official statistics, timeliness can be an issue. With the labor force survey that is about quarterly results, it's relatively okay. We already have data for most of the 2021 quarters. Structural business statistics, it's typically slower, also because the data is often collected after companies have closed their accounting obligations for the government. And as I said, we just select tourism industries, which means we exclude some that probably have a relevance. And in the ones we include, we have to count everybody, regardless of if they ever serve a tourist in their restaurant or not. So finally, the data I showed in the slides is actually the Eurostat data. And as you know, there's legal basis of what countries have to send to us, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. It's not an iceberg, but it's an iceberg salad. So this is what we see. We see the outer shell, we see the big pictures. We have detail by industry, but not always at the same level as what countries send us, because countries send us like the lowest common denominator of what we agreed in meetings with all 27 countries. So in terms of detail by industry, in terms of subnational detail, we don't have everything. However, for the countries, they can turn this thing around and actually can go much further in terms of disaggregation. So of course, they can use their own microdata available at the NSI. They can see all the layers, like you can detect the layers in this salads. They can access the sources of some of the statistical data. For instance, to compile labor force survey, they might use some social security data, which they can return to if they want to get more refined data. Also, they might use auxiliary data sets at regional level or even at local level to calibrate their data. So they can use all of this. So what we can not do, the NSIs can probably have a much finer model, maybe even go into infra-annual detail. So if you want to develop something for your country or for your region, it's not going to come from Eurostat data or OECD data, because it's, as I said, it's the top layer. But in your country, there's often a wide range of options to dig deeper and to have to have a refined model, even at regional or sometimes local level. Because these data is actually, if it's collected from enterprises, you can group it for the enterprises in a given city. If it's collected from households, it's the same. Of course, there's always the sample size issue. So I hope this encourages you to do something similar for your country or regional observatory. So this was my contribution to the webinar. I hope it was